Hi, I'm John Serruto, and welcome to part 2 with John Florio and Ouise Shapiro, the authors of One Nation Under Baseball. And you know, Ouise, we had a great discussion about different events that took place in the 60s. Why should somebody be interested in this book that didn't live through the 60s?
Well, I think if they want any kind of history, if they're at all curious about the great turbulent 60s, all of the things that went on outside of baseball and then inside of baseball, and then also in terms of the politics and the race and history and culture. It's all in this book, and what we tried to do was we tried to sort of weave baseball in everything else that was going on in society into, you know, throughout the entire decade. So you really get a sense of what was happening in the country. And it was such a momentous period in American history that, and I think that, you know, it's full of stories. So you really get a sense through all of the stories about what was happening in the country.
Well, very much so, in the sense that I think anybody who's lived through that period, to really understand how we are here today, if you haven't lived through that period, you really need to understand the 60s, because out of all the decades, we had the greatest revolution, evolution of society.
I think that's true, because, you know, I was going to say, you could probably take any decade, and since baseball's such a prime American institution, and look at history through those 10 years, and there'll be some changes, but there'll be moderate changes. There'll be some things, maybe, you know, you go from a dead ball era to a live ball era. There's some things that happened, but in the 60s, the changes were made, just like in society, the changes were major and they were constant. I mean, every year there were some of the most significant changes in baseball. Some of the top 3 or 4 significant changes, one of which being the Players Association, happened in the 60s. So when you go from 60 to 70, you get a much bigger change in society and in the game, which reflects a society in America, baseball, so much more than any other decade.
And if you look at baseball in 1960 and you look at it in 1970, it's a different game.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that in terms of race, in terms of the coverage of the game, and in terms of the labor issue, it's a different game. In 1960, the owners were in total control over the players. The players had no say whatsoever in their salaries and in the you know, any aspect of their working conditions. By 1970, the hegemony of the players, of the owners, is practically broken. It'll be fully broken in the mid-70s. And in 1970 and 1960, you have a game that is almost, really, it's almost exclusively white still, even though Jackie Robinson had integrated. By 1970, 15% of the players are players of color.
And in 71, you have the first all-minority lineup for the Pittsburgh Pirates take the field. That would never happen in 1960, you know.
So and in 1960 and in 1961, you had a player, a pitcher, writing a book, Jim Brosnan, about his own experiences in the majors. He wrote 2 books, The Pennant Race and The Long Season. And they were very revelatory, but really about him and about his own experience of trying to hang on in the major leagues as a marginal pitcher. And he didn't even say anything offensive about management, but already the owners they don't like what he's saying.
I don't like this. You can't have a voice.
Yeah.
I don't like you speaking.
Was that part of a contract that they controlled their personal behavior or personal?
There was a line in the contract, and they used it with Brosnan to silence him. And eventually, you know, he played out a couple of years and he left the game and he continued writing. But the most interesting piece of language in a contract, as long as we're talking about this, is the reserve clause.
Can you explain briefly what the reserve clause is?
Yeah, and it was a piece of language in baseball players' contracts that was never really questioned, because it was always there and it just kept appearing. And depending on how you interpret it, but the general interpretation at the time was that if you signed with the team had a right to renew your contract for 1 more year after that. And you couldn't go anywhere else for the year after that. Now, the way it was interpreted was that, so you signed, they have the right for that 1 more year, you can't go anywhere else. And then once you go that 1 more year, well, then they have 1 more year, and then they have 1 more year. So basically, it's in perpetuity, right? It'll go forever. And it wasn't until Marvin Miller becomes the head of the Players Association that he reads it and says, well, you know, I'm reading this language, and it looks to me like if somebody doesn't sign and they play the one more year, they're done. They're a free agent. And that starts leading to a whole bunch of questions that the owners don't like, you know, and Marvin, it leads to Curt Flood. It leads to a lot of issues.
Curt Flood challenges the reserve clause. He gets
Right.
traded from the St. Louis Cardinals to the Philadelphia Phillies.
Doesn't want to go to Philadelphia. Many black players didn't want to go to Philadelphia at that time. It was a tough place for black players to play. He gets a notice that he's being traded from St. Louis, where he had a pretty stable life and some roots. He was going to Philadelphia. He didn't want to go. He was at the tail end of his career. And he calls up Marvin Miller and says, I don't want to go. What can we do about this? Why can't I go to another team? I mean, he knows why, but he'd like to fight it. And Miller, the head of the Players Association, he's only been there a few years, Miller, but he says to him, listen, if you fight this, you're going to lose. You're not going to win. And basically, they decide that Flood will do it anyway because it will make it that much easier for the next time around for it to work. So people look back the same way they think back to 1947 integrating baseball. And it really, I mean, it did, I guess technically there was a black player taking the field, that the sport was integrated. The color line had been broken. It wasn't really integrated until many years later. We spoke about that before. In this way, people look back and they think Curt Flood was the solution to the reserve clause, that he fought the reserve clause and he won. He didn't. He fought the reserve clause and he weakened it a bit and left it open that it would be broken down the line.
And then he actually lost the case in the Supreme Court, but it wasn't until the mid-70s when Marvin Miller represented, and the Players Association represented two pitchers, Dave McNally and Andy Messersmith, in their quest to become free agents. And it went to a third party.
Mm-hmm.
It went to a third party to resolve it, and it was
Peter Sykes, right?
Peter Sykes was the
arbitrator,
and he ruled in favor of the two pitchers, and that really is what broke the hegemony of the owners, because now you have free agency, and anything goes. Players don't. I mean, players still have to stay with their original team for 5 years, but now they can sell their services to the highest bidder.
Yeah, so as you see today, two generations of fans don't realize anything but what we call free agency, but we saw the different part of it. And of course, Curt Flood was definitely a trailblazer on that. Unfortunately, he didn't benefit from his actions, and I know it took a toll on him physically.
He did play again, actually.
Yeah, Washington.
He came back over to Washington Senators, and he was offered a deal that reads a little more like today's contracts, because he was allowed to leave the team after a year, and that was put in there by Marvin Miller. Marvin Miller said, if you're going to sign this contract, you can't sign with the reserve clause because we're still appealing. You know, you can't do that. But he signed and was able to leave after a year, but he had already been out of the game for a year and a half. He didn't stick around. He didn't stick around long. But one of the things I wanted to bring up about that, the arbitration hearing, the McNally and Messersmith hearing, is that when we first started writing the book, we mentioned at the top half that we wanted to write it about Jim Bouton. You know, we follow the 60s. Jim Bouton writes this book, Ball 4. We spoke about it before in 1970. One of the reasons the owners and Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner, didn't like that book and wanted to squash it was not because he told stories about his players. It's because he was revealing the contract negotiations between the team and the players, and it did not make the owners look good. So they were really trying to squash it for that reason. They called him a Benedict Arnold. They spun it in the paper, and by the way, inadvertently made it a more popular book than it ever would have been, right? But when that hearing comes about with Messersmith and McNally, Ball 4 is used as evidence, and those the diary pages are considered transcripts.
Evidence.
Yeah, evidence. And it was used to help free agency. So that book, Ball 4, where we said all the things that led up to it in the 60s, that's what made us write about the 60s. When you look at the effects of Ball 4, it had a strong hand in free agency.
Well, free agency, again, you know, the antitrust laws didn't apply to Major League Baseball for years, and I think after that happened, of course, it was a moot point whether it was antitrust or not. Let me ask you this, John Florio. The difference between the 1970, 72, 75 versus the 60s, what changes did you see? What changes did you feel?
Well, seeing firsthand is different because I was like, I don't remember, I was too young to remember 62. But I think the difference between the 60s and the 70s, the mid-60s and the mid-70s, is that visually, upon first looking at the game, there was much more color on the field. And that was a great thing. I think that it brought up, like, you know, people talk about, well, Babe Ruth did this, and all of these guys who did this, but, you know, the talent pool was diluted. The black players were playing in the Negro Leagues. They weren't on the same field. You know, so come the 70s, when you're looking at baseball, you're looking at black and white players playing on the field, and that's a real visual difference. Ouise and I spoke at the New York Public Library, and the way we opened the presentation was showing team photos from 1961 and team photos from 71, and you almost didn't have to speak. All you had to do was show the slide, and the difference is right there. So I think visually, that's a big difference for me.
And in 1971, on September 1st, 1971, the Pittsburgh Pirates fielded an all-black starting lineup. And
all minority starting lineup.
All
right?
minority.
Hispanic, black.
Yeah, black, Hispanic, black.
And really, it got very little mention. I mean, there was I think, a paragraph in the Sporting News the following week. There had been a newspaper strike, I think, in Pittsburgh at the time, but you know, the wire services didn't pick up on it. It was a non-issue, and it wasn't until the third or fourth inning in the game that I think
Cash? Who was it?
It was one of the players.
Referenced the second baseman as being Jackie Robinson.
Oh, well, that's
later. A different.
Yeah.
No, that's a different story. But in this case, somebody's in the dugout and looks at the lineup and says, "Hey, we're all brothers out there."
Yeah.
I forget which player it was. The story you're talking about, Tim McCarver spoke to us and gave us a great story. Which was it spring training?
Yeah.
Spring training. The Cardinals are playing the Pirates, and I think Lou Brock comes to bat. And he looks out at the Pirates, and they're all black except for Mazeroski at second base, which was Jackie Robinson's position. He played second, and he looks at, among other positions. And Lou Brock looks out at him, and the white guy on the all-black field, he goes, "Hey, Jackie Robinson."
But, you know, to your point, Ouise, a long way from the segregated sitting that took place in Florida back in 1960-61, the segregated hotels that players stayed in. Now we're looking at 1971, a decade of change, acceptance, understanding, equality. So again, the history of what we talked about in here. Do you have a favorite character in this book, aside from the Beatles or a group?
Okay, so my favorite has always been Bob Gibson. He was my favorite pitcher. He was, when I was in undergraduate school, I wrote an article about Bob Gibson's 1968
at Boston
season.
University,
At
right?
Boston University. I wrote an article about Bob Gibson's 1968 season, and it took forever, but I finally got his phone number, and I called him, and you know, he's a bit of he had a reputation as being surly and not particularly friendly, but I was determined to get this interview with him for my paper, and I called him up, and he answered the phone. I recognized his voice, and he said, "Hello," and I said, "Oh, hi, I'm looking for Bob Gibson," and he said, "Oh, he doesn't live here anymore." And I said, "Oh, because you sound just like him." I said, "So I was, you know, I got your name from so-and-so who gave it from so-and-so, you know, I'm writing this paper on you," and he didn't want anything to do with it, but he did agree to talk to me for 5 minutes. And I had gone to my parents' house, and I had my mother on the other line taking notes in case the tape recorder didn't work, because I didn't want to miss anything. And you know, the thing is, he had a remarkable season. Up until that point, probably the greatest pitching season. 1.12 ERA.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it was an incredible season. And his answer was, well, when you have a long career, you always have one season that stands out. And I said, "Oh, come on, that is being so modest." But at any rate, there was something about the way he pitched, and he did pitch with a lot of anger, it seemed.
Anger, passion,
yeah,
intimidation. Yeah.
And we talked to Tim McCarver when we were writing the book, and Tim McCarver told us about his anger.
Yeah, we said, what was it that made him so great, and what was it that made him so great in 1968? And the first thing he said was control. He said he had pinpoint control. Wherever I put my glove, it landed. He said, and I'm talking within 1/8 of an inch, and I'm talking for the entire season. He said if pitchers can do that for 2 or 3 innings, it's amazing. He said he did it for the entire season. And we said, all right, but Bob Gibson always had good control. He said the other thing is that after the Martin Luther King assassination, Bob Gibson was really upset. He couldn't do a lot. There was nothing he could do about his anger. Where was a black man going to bring his anger in 1968 over the Martin Luther King assassination? He was their hope, and now he's been assassinated. What was Bob Gibson going to do? He would have done it. There's no channel for him, right? He takes that anger and he puts it into every fastball he throws for the entire season. He was in a zone, this is according to Tim McCarver, this is not my thoughts, he was in a zone he was untouchable. He was alone out there. It was him against the world. I mean, I felt for the batters having to get up there against him because he was throwing heat.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And high and tight.
Yeah, high
which he couldn't do today.
Yeah, right,
but
right.
Yes,
which
he was.
He was
Just tremendous. John, again, one event. If you were to look at one event in the '60s, what stands out? Where do you think there's a message of change?
You know, I've mentioned this to Ouise because for me, being a musician in 1968, same year as Gibson, Jose Feliciano singing the Star-Spangled Banner at the World Series between
Hispanic man.
An Hispanic man.
Different type of Star-Spangled Banner?
Right. Cuts up is singing a kind of a blues interpretation, which he thought was a thank you to his country for giving him so much. Well, I mean, people go crazy. This is during the time you got the Vietnam War going now. People have, you have to do things the way they're supposed to be done. And Ouise and I even wrote an article on this for The Atlantic about Feliciano. And I just think the guy went up there and did a really great job. For me, it resonates because I remember my parents, my mother thinking, what is he doing? This is a disgrace. Why is he singing like this? The cameras cut off him. They won't show him. The people who were supposed to be playing behind him stopped playing. They start saying, look at him slouched there on the stool wearing sunglasses. How disgraceful. Well, first of all, he's blind, so he's wearing sunglasses. He's sitting on a stool because he's blind. He can't see where, he's playing the guitar. He's playing a folk guitar. The things they found wrong with what he was doing were such trumped up rush to judgment charges. And I think that encapsulates the 60s in a lot of ways. I think that there was a lot of rush to judgment. There was a lot of profiling. There was a lot of assumptions going on. And if you had to bring it together for one moment for me that I can really remember clearly experiencing, it's Feliciano singing the Star-Spangled Banner.
Ouise, similar?
I think for me, the biggest event was probably the whole unionization of the game. I think because that fundamentally changed the economics of the game, and it freed the players finally to sell their services to the highest bidder, and it took the owners down a few pegs, and I think it created more balance in the game, and and then of course other sports followed.
For me, my takeaway was the fact that finally it was okay to question the authority. It was okay to question the institution. Muhammad Ali, for religious purposes, I didn't understand it back then. I thought he was being unpatriotic. As the years went on, I started to understand it. And it was those types of actions and those types of changes that we see throughout the book that really put us to where we are today in a progressive country, in a progressive, equal country. You wrote this book together. What is it like to write a book? You both have written independently. You're in the production business. Ouise, again, for full disclosure, you've worked on documentaries with Joe Levine, of course, our neighbor up here in New Providence, some great work. I told you I just watched the Namath work the other night. I've seen the Lombardi. I've seen the 30 for 30. What's it like to work jointly on a book? Who takes what responsibility? And plus, you're married.
Well, primarily I do the research and the editing, and John does the writing. And then together, we sort of map out the storyline and figure out what the arcs of the story are and how we're going to approach the story. And we have this big, huge board in our office, and with all the little stickies that we're constantly moving around, which is what Joe and I do in the edit room too. And you're constantly working on what's the story we're telling, what's the story, how are we telling it, and then I really go off and do the bulk of the research. And John, I sort of prepare a chapter at a time with all my notes, and I lay out how I think that the chapter should go, and then I hand it to John, and he writes it, and then he gives it back to me, and I edit it, and then we go back and forth from there.
John, what's it like? You've written novels, okay, now you write a book off research with some personal opinion too, and you're really kind of weaving these two themes together of what's happening in society through baseball. What is the difference between a novel for you to write? Is it more challenging?
Well, it's a different challenge, certainly. The similarity is that in both, you want to tell a good story. You want to really, in a beginning that pulls somebody in, a middle that keeps them hanging in there, and an end that is hopefully satisfying or that at least ties up all the ends. And you want that in both. I think with a novel, you're going away from the truth, though. That's a different muscle. You're trying to think of what can I add here that would be, let me stop thinking of reality and let me start thinking more fancy. Whereas with the nonfiction, you're always trying to find the absolute truth, the absolute truth, the absolute truth. That's really, there's constant digging. Which is more challenging? I don't know, but I think that working together with Ouise in a nonfiction capacity, I love it because in that digging for truth, Ouise's always, and together we do it too, but Ouise will find things and say, hey, I didn't know that this was happening, and there's a real excitement to that kind of discovery. When you're coming up with something like, baseball in the 60s, and all of a sudden there's a story that we didn't know, or there's something that, an interaction between Mayor Lindsay and the Mets at the time, or, that's really fun, and also to be able to share it with somebody as opposed to doing it on your own, where it's exciting, but when, the idea of coming home and going, well, you're not going to wait, you're not going to believe this, that makes it, writing can be lonely, working with someone else and working in a capacity like that really is not lonely at all. It's actually quite social.
We've interviewed a lot of authors here and some first-time authors. Now, let me ask you this, because you write for a living in all capacities. Do you hit writer's block?
Sometimes.
Do you have a favorite place where you can think best?
In bed. That's where I tell John I do my best thinking. The thing about writer's block when you have someone you're working with is you can just say to them, I'm stuck, help, and then usually they'll bail you out. But really, I have to say, I live by this book that Stephen King wrote. He wrote a book called On Writing. And the first half is a memoir, and the second half is really about the techniques of writing. And he says in it, you always just have to ask yourself, what am I trying to say? What is my story? And am I telling the story I want to tell? And I find it so valuable. I find it so helpful when I'm stuck on something. So, I don't know.
That was a particular challenge, though, with this book. Ouise and I wrote another book together called One Punch from the Promised Land, which is about Leon and Michael Spinks, two boxing champions in the 70s and 80s, brothers. And it was a little simpler then because, simple isn't the right word. It's always tough to write a book, but in this case you had two arcs. You had Leon Spinks and you had Michael Spinks. They crisscross in a lot of different ways, and you had some great supporting cast, Ali and all these other fighters of the 70s and 80s. Here, it's a necklace of probably 100 or 200 stories. So you mentioned that we had the stickies on the board in the office, but I don't think we ever had as many as we had for this book. And you're trying to do it in a way that people by 2/3 of the way through the book are familiar with certain characters. So if you can, you'd like to tell it through their point of view because they've gotten to know those people. You don't want to introduce new people when there's 5 pages left in a book. So you're trying to tell a story, and you're trying to tell it through a set number of characters who were there for these 10 years. It's all true, so you have to dig for stories that happen to these people and that weave together in a way that somebody reads disjointed, what could be easily disjointed material, and that we hope feels like one fluid ride through the whole thing.
And I have to be honest, There are times that are really the most frustrating times are when you have what you think is a great story, and then you go to confirm it, and you find out that it didn't really happen, or that you can't get enough corroboration to go with it.
Well, that brings me to another point. You know, when you're writing something of research, you know, you have to make sure, I am sure, that these are actual facts. What do you do to cross-check?
If the people are still alive, or anyone who witnessed it, or experienced the event, we call them. We dig in old newspaper articles. We talk to anyone we can who can corroborate. We had a case of during the 1968 riots in Detroit. Willie Horton supposedly left the Tigers locker room in his Tigers uniform, didn't get dressed in his civilian clothes, and went out to the riot, to where the riots were taking place, got on top of a truck or a car, and tried to quell the rioters. And that story has been promulgated. It's been all over the place, and I thought...
And it could very well be true. We're not saying it's not true, but...
But in every case, I double and triple check. You have to source this material, so... We started calling around. We were asking photographers that were there, reporters that were there, that covered it, and nobody had the story. And there was a documentary that was on HBO about the Tigers in 1968 that had the story. So I called the producer and I said, where did you get the information? And he said, from 2 clubhouse guys that saw Willie Horton leaving with his uniform on. And I said, but how does that confirm the story? Did they know where he was going? And he said, oh, let me check my notes and I'll get back to you. And he never got back to me.
So you didn't put it out?
No, we didn't put it. We didn't.
No, and we're not saying in any way that the story's not true, but we didn't include it because we couldn't.
But you wanted credible reporting, and
yes,
you pride yourself on that. All right, the last couple minutes we have. All right, John. Again, you work with a great writer here in Ouise. Briefly, 15 seconds. Her greatest strength.
The reason I'm quiet is because there's so many. It's not because I can't think of one. I would say she may be the best researcher ever in sports reporting, ever. I think I'm not exaggerating. I think if you ask other people in the industry, you can ask the people who work with her at HBO and ESPN, I think her research skills are unbelievable. And that's why we wouldn't go with a story that wasn't double or triple sourced. And I think that she's incredible at that. And I also think, because I said there's more than one, she's got an incredible knack for story. To shape a story, to know what makes a good story, what belongs in that story, what keeps people interested, and what's fascinating material. I think that she's fantastic.
Highly complimentary there, Ouise Shapiro. Now you have a chance to respond.
I knew he was going to ask that. That's why I was so complimentary. I wasn't going to set myself up
in the last 15, 20 seconds.
John's a terrific writer. He's a terrific writer. He can turn a phrase better than anyone I know, and he's just such a facile writer. I'm so admiring of that. And he's just so easy to work with. Neither one of us, I guess, has a big ego about it. So when we argue about something, it's really just arguing about the material, and we're not. He's not wedded to something that he writes. He says, "Oh, if it doesn't belong there, just cut it." And so I think we bring the right strengths to our collaboration.
Well, Ouise Shapiro and John Florio, I agree, because the chemistry is certainly shown in this great book here that you wrote.
Well, thank you.
Nice history of the 60s and baseball intertwined together. It's been a real pleasure to have you at Hometown Television. We wish you the best of luck moving forward.
Thanks very much for having us,
Yeah,
John.
it was great. Thank you so much.
A lot of fun.
You bet. And thank you for joining this segment.